Vogel. I'm president and CEO of an organization called the National Design Alliance. And our principal program is called Reimagine America's Schools. We're funded by Schmidt Futures and have been really following up on work that a lot of us have been spending our career on, but looking at the way we design the learning environment and how we might think differently about the learning environment to support values and goals and philosophies that we generally share as a culture. So this year, we have not been able to be in the field as we had been in previous years, working directly with educators, students, teachers, parents, and others. So what we've been doing this year is really looking at key issues that we believe either will or should design the way we think about public education. And since our work is on the school environment, if we change public education, therefore we must change the way we think about the design of the school. We've really studied 4 key areas by convening forums like this, focused on several key issues. One is learning at the intersection of technology and design. We've worked with the ISTE organization on that, along with Siegel. We've looked at disaster preparedness. How can schools be more able to respond to times of crisis or emergency as a center and resource for communities beyond just its education and educational needs of the children. A third area we had been looking at before and are still looking at is what some call active learning, but really looking at the whole issue of STEM and STEAM and maker, hands-on, project-based as exciting new innovations in education and designing the schools that support and encourage those kinds of engagements. And finally, the topic we're studying and looking at today is the whole issue of designing for equity, designing for inclusion. And then perhaps as early as next spring, we hope to be back in the field working with communities and bringing these ideas and these recommendations and strategies to communities. Why is this important? Well, frankly, it's pragmatic. Before the pandemic, we were spending in the neighborhood of $50 billion a year building or renovating schools. And sadly, 90% of those buildings are based on a 1950s model rather than thinking about 2050. So we really are trying to leverage the investment that communities are making to create more dynamic, engaging, and supporting environments for learning. And as it turns out, for supporting the community that our schools are in. And that's what we begin to get into in today's conversation. So I'm very pleased to have been joined again by our friends at Siegel Endowments. They are doing amazing work. They have reimagined infrastructure and the built environment in ways that are really creating a new roadmap for all of us that will lead to a more sustainable and equitable future. And we're excited to be working with them. And especially excited, Joshua, that you're here today co-moderating the conversation. Welcome and listen to your opening comments.
Perfect. Thanks, Ron. Really excited to join you again for such an important discussion that we have today. Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua Elder. I'm the Director of Grants Management at Siegel Family Endowment. Siegel Family Endowment is a foundation focused on understanding and shaping the impact of technology on society. And we're really excited to be a part of this continuing conversation with Ron and Reimagine America's Schools. As Ron mentioned, the focus of today's panel is designing learning environments that are more equitable and inclusive spaces for students, their families, and their teachers. And especially now more than ever with the shift to remote learning in the midst of an ongoing conversation about how schools should accommodate the evolving needs of students and communities, we feel this topic is just more timely now and relevant than ever. At Siegel, we support organizations that work at the intersections of our 3 interest areas: learning, workforce, and infrastructure. As you heard Ron talk about the ways that we have been reimagining the future of infrastructure. Today's conversation addresses aspects of all three of those interest areas, but really want to call out the intersection between learning and infrastructure in particular. When we talk about infrastructure, we look at it, as Ryan mentioned, through this multidimensional lens and think that all infrastructure projects, regardless of which sector that they originate in, have tangible digital, physical, and social impacts. These are all factors that need to be taken into account at all stages of infrastructure planning and development. Right now, there's a lot of talk about vast amounts of infrastructure funding waiting to be unlocked through a potential stimulus package or a large-scale infrastructure bill. We're really hopeful that at least some of that funding will be made available specifically for school infrastructure. However, if that money doesn't come, we also feel that there's a lot that can be done right now using existing resources to build better schools and experiences for learners that are more equitable, inclusive, and future forward. In this conversation today, we really hope we can generate some ideas, both to how to steward potential new and increased resources, and for ways to use design as a way to leverage our existing resources more effectively. I think Ron said, we're not going to have all of the solutions, but really excited for just brainstorming and hearing from this diverse set of panelists that we have today, and just excited that they are here, and look forward to also taking your questions from those of you that are joining us virtually. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Josh. So before we meet our panel, I want to invite everybody that's in our audience to tell us hi and tell us where you're watching from. Looks like we have a very full auditorium today. Well, you have to close your eyes and imagine that, but tell us hi. And while you're doing that, let's meet our panelists. Patricia, why don't we start with you, introduce yourself, and then introduce the next person that you would like to see introduce themselves.
Okay. All right. So my name is Patricia Joseph. I am an emerging professional working as a designer at Cunningham Group Architecture in the Denver, Colorado office. Some of the work we've done includes the facilitation of multiple school master plans and close coordination with project designers. I am originally from Massachusetts and raised by Haitian parents. So I speak 2 languages, and I enjoy things, all things dance, music, and puppies. So I'm very happy to be here. School has always been a great memory of mine, and I'd like to turn it over to Kyle.
Thanks, Patricia. Hi, everyone. Kyle Conley. I'm calling in from just outside of Boston. I am the Chief Impact Officer of Citizen Schools. We are a national nonprofit and grantee of Siegel. So just express our gratitude to Josh and his team. We focus on reducing the opportunity gap by providing career mentors and hands-on science instruction to middle school students. So I come to this work by way of about 20 years of, at the risk of dating myself, about 20 years of teaching, school principaling, and overall school improvement reform initiative supporter. So glad to be here today. Really excited to talk about this role that I think, or this question that we have about the role that design plays in school improvement. And the lens that I'll bring forward to the panel is definitely all about instructional equity and rigor and access. So I'd love to allow Imani to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, or whatever time of day, wherever you are. I am an architect in Detroit with Gensler. I moved to Detroit in 2015, really to start working on community-oriented projects like Detroit Public Schools. And so I spend quite a bit of my time working on renovating old, pretty strong-boned Detroit buildings, Detroit Public School buildings. And so coming out of the bankruptcy and just some issues in that actual system, there are a lot of things that kind of move far beyond my capacity as a formally trained architect. So I'm really excited to talk about just thinking advocacy-wise, social policy-wise, just what it means to go beyond the design of the school and maybe reach into the community to think about adult school, vocational school, all of the different types of things that make schools a community hub. And so whenever I talk about education, I always invite everybody to just kind of remember your own educational experience, just, whatever comes to your mind. If that's a positive experience, I'm excited for you. If it's a negative experience in any way, or if it's just a kind of forget the word for it, but if it's just kind of like a middle ground experience, just imagine what that impact has had on your life and your career, the way you think about speaking, all of those sorts of things. And I think that will maybe help you engage with the conversation today and how important it is for the design of that space to be exemplary. So I'll pass it over to Dan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Imani. I'm Dan Foreman. I'm hailing to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I saw a number of people saying they are from Pittsburgh. More specifically, I'm from Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. So that is where I am from today, but I am the Associate Director of Professional Learning for Verizon Innovative Learning Schools managed by Digital Promise, which is a long, crazy title, but what we do is what we provide is a full-scale ecosystem for instructional technology for high needs middle schools across the country. So I'm currently over 300. I'm adding even more. We're planning to be in a couple more hundred in the next couple of years. And what we do is every single student gets a device. Every single student gets an internet connection. We also fund a full-time coach to be able to be working with our students and our teachers so that they can be able to be prepared through all of this. And what's been interesting is all of our schools, even though they are in the neighborhoods that are traditionally underfunded, traditionally not provided with the same level of resources, when we all had to move into the virtual space, our schools were prepared because we had provided the entire ecosystem, overlaid everything that they needed. Basically in March, all of our students went home and became virtual students, and they had everything they need to be prepared, to include data plans, to include the devices and the training and everything. So I work for Digital Promise, and what we are doing is we are kind of like a research think tank in between technology and research and schools. But I come out of the public school system. So I was a teacher, I was a director of instructional technology, I was an instructional technology coach, and working with teachers across the board on how do we improve the use of instructional technology for all of our students and start rethinking what school is, what it could be, and ultimately getting to what it should be, and through an equitable idea of how can we rethink what is this thing called school that all of us have to go through, and how can we make it better and more equitable for everybody that's involved, because it is what builds society. That's kind of it in a nutshell. I'm going to pass it over to Stephen.
Thank you. I was interested to hear Patricia introduce herself as an emerging professional, and I was sitting here thinking, well, what's the opposite of an emerging professional? I don't know whether I'm a veteran or I'm not sure what I am, but I've been around for a while, and I'm an architect and I'm an urban planner. I'm the CEO of a company called Concordia. We do community-centered planning and design. Concordia literally is the Latin word for the word that means harmony. So my special interest is in complex adaptive systems. So I'm always thinking of how everything fits into everything else. So I was actually interested to hear Joshua talk about the 3 pillars and how they really are all connected to each other, because I firmly believe that's the case. It's the ecosystem, right? And I guess I got started in this topic back in the 1990s, actually in the Clinton administration, worked with Secretary Dick Riley back in those days to create a research document called Schools as Centers of Community, still just as alive as it was then, I think. And other projects that I've worked on that I think relate to this conversation is the things where I've learned the most. We did the recovery plan for New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. We had 9,000 people involved in that process, and we couldn't have done it without all 9,000 people. So there's a lot to be learned about that, and engagement and inclusion, equity as it relates to inclusion, and all of those things. Most recently, we've just completed a master plan or actually a school in Emeryville, California, called the Emeryville Center for Community Life. It's not a school. It's not it is a school, but our client was the city of Emeryville and the school district of Emeryville and the school board, both at the same time. So we ended up designing a facility that does a lot of different things, which include education. The latest one we did on the piggybacking on that was actually in Palo Alto. called the Coverly Community Center, which included not only parks and recreation services, not only education service, but also workforce housing for teachers and for city workers, because we all know that it's hard for teachers and city workers to actually live in Palo Alto right now. So these are the issues, some of the issues I think we're all faced with in terms of this amazing topic of inclusion and equity. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks. Before we jump into it, I need to say, Dan, several people have commented on your moose, and not necessarily in a positive way, but no, just kidding, of course.
That's why it's there.
That's why it's there. So let's get into this conversation. Thanks again for being a part of this. We've already talked to the panelists about this idea that Josh and I have, that we would like this to be more of a conversation than a classic Q&A kind of panel. And so we hope that you'll begin to play off of each other and ask each other questions and so forth. But Josh and I have three roles. One will be to keep us within the guardrails. We want to stay on topic. We don't want to become too theoretical. We want to be grounded in real strategies and real ideas. Number two, we might insert a question or two. We invite the audience to send questions through chat, and we'll try to see if we can squeeze them in from time to time, especially if the panel is beginning to lose a little energy. Maybe we can insert a question or two to spice it back up again. And so I want to start, though, by having the panel kind of self-define the scope of our discussion. I mean, here's the deal. When we think about equity and inclusion, I think we generally think about programs, policies, training, gaining awarenesses of various kind. But I think we think too little about the role of design, the design process, as well as the ultimate design. And so I'd like for you all to help us start this conversation. I'd like each of you to respond. When you think about the ways that design can impact and affect equity and inclusion, I'd like to hear what your thoughts on that are. I want to start with Patricia, because Patricia, all of your fans of the Cunningham Group have been tweeting and cheering for you. So we're going to start with you, no pressure. But what are the thoughts that come to mind to you as an emerging design professional when we think about equity and design and integrity and equity?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I guess something that we talk about often at Cunningham Group is designing with and not for. And that's a beautiful concept, because I think that it gets at the root of, answering this question, and that is, who are we designing for? Who's going to be in our spaces? Who might be looking onto our spaces, right? And who are we designing a space next to? So there's a lot of relationships involved when you create a space, when you change a space. There's a lot of people and persons that are involved in that process. So thinking, how do we do that? I think it starts with looking at all the people who are involved. And, that's the student to the parent to the person facilitating inside the space. And, each person's going to see it differently or need something of the space differently. And to design with equity and inclusion is to have those voices included in the process, and to look at all aspects and equitably, right? You examine the outcome, you examine the possibilities, and you start to think about what exactly will this, what is this space going to leave this user with? Am I going to be able to facilitate in the space to all the different types of learning styles there are? So there's a lot of relationships and connections that first need to be defined, and then possibly solved. And so it's funny, because there's not one, I don't think there's one solution for each school or each place. I think it's very much rooted in the process of finding a solution for each group or each community or each school.
Yeah, Patricia, Ron, if it's okay, if we just sort of jump right in, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because when I think about equity and really meaningful education experiences, what pops in my head first and foremost is agency, and the agency that a community and an individual student bring to their school. And what you're talking about right there is making sure to really include all of the voices of community members and those that are going to use the school or the learning space. I guess to Stephen's point, not just a school, right, but any space where people are coming together and learning. So I'm thinking a lot about how we go about ensuring that the people who are using said space are actually driving the decision making. And I think one thing that sort of sometimes can get often overlooked is it is really getting clear with a community, with the users of a space, what it is that, how they define success for this space and what it is that they're hoping to achieve from that space. And a lot of times in the educational space, what we'll hear is, maybe a particular instructional strategy or, or whatever that looks like. But I think I think it's important that we go a little deeper than that. And we think really clearly about what does education mean to a community? And that actually matters a lot. I was in a community once, actually in another country where there was a large presence of a BMW plant, and the problem was that in this small town, most of the students were graduating without the skills to actually find career paths within their local community, and they didn't necessarily have the engineering tools and what they needed to be able to compete with international applicants. And so by sitting down and having a conversation on what it is that families and community wanted for their students, we could then start to think about what does an educational experience look like for students within that particular context. And so all of that is just a really long-winded way of saying, Patricia, I couldn't agree more with you. It is about context. It's about reacting to the needs of the local community and putting that first and foremost above whatever we think as outsiders it should be.
Yeah, I think I think defining the success of education by the community standards is really important. And I don't want to get too boring about this, but I think my experience in Detroit is that when I walk into a school building, 9 times out of 10, I'm not even sure. I'm not thinking about like innovative design solutions. I'm thinking like, why is it cold in here? Why are the lights not on? Why is the air quality not okay? Why are the drinking fountains taped off? There's so many issues that are infrastructural that actually, it goes to code minimums almost, or what we define as acceptable versus what successfully is. Because a lot of times it's not like we're going to jump from this dilapidated, deplorable condition to like a new age, innovative facility. There's really kind of incremental, equitable steps in between that just say you deserve access to clean, non-contaminated drinking water. And by code, when I step into the building, I'm, thinking about ADA probably first, a lot of the restrictions, and then, just structure that allows me to make that more inclusive, so in terms of physical barriers, but then just thinking infrastructurally at base level, we accept really, really bad conditions. And I think that's really not okay. And that gets very complicated when you try to address or reverse those. But in my brain, I always kind of go to, backing up as opposed to jumping in and being like, okay, let's add. It's like, really, let's just sit for a moment and realize that we accepted this for decades and allowed it to get worse and worse and worse without there being something that said, oh my goodness, no one should ever have to live or learn this way. A community asset, such as a school, really indicates how the community around it will survive or deteriorate or thrive. And so when we say, oh, it's cool that this school is just in complete disrepair, we're really saying we don't care about the entire community. And so that to me is the first equitable thing, is to start to really address at a systemic level what we think is okay, or what we're allowing to be the environment of any given city and in any economic situation, whether they are able to financially cover these excellent spaces versus these really tough projects.
Couldn't agree more, Amani. My first classroom was in one of those buildings that is now defunct and condemned. But it is definitely something that hits home to me of when I walk into a space, and especially a teaching and learning space, and knowing what that says to me as an individual and thinking about those individual students walking in. Is it welcoming? Is it a place that I want to go and learn? Is it a place that I want to go every day and be with my friends and be seen by my friends and see all of those people? Like what we're seeing is an acceptance of the reality that there are those that have and those that have not, and it starts in school. And it's really being pushed in that direction. And we have to kind of interject and start rethinking what is the purpose of schooling and what is the purpose of schooling to the community, because all of our school buildings are built around the management of the physical body, not for the release of, the mind and starting to think about learning. And that's really what we've designed everything for, is to get you from point A to point B through a building in as controlled environment as possible. And for me, I've been in hundreds of schools in my career now, and I can walk in and know exactly what the culture of the school is based off of walking through the building and just listening. I can know that this school is more focused on controlling. It's less focused on learning. It's more focused on whether or not the students can do well on the test, as opposed to, does the test even really matter? And can we get into more project-based things? And you can tell that very quickly, the more that you're in these schools and the more that you're walking around them. And it's interesting to see that, because now those students are embodying those things. They are bringing that in, and it's becoming a part of their self-actualization of who they are. This is what I deserve, and those kids deserve that. And that's not okay in my book, from what I have seen and what I experienced. Because my first classroom, I could see the Capitol building in DC, and it was completely falling apart. And it was 95 degrees in the winter and 60 degrees in the summer, because they just blasted everything to the best possible way that they could. A few years later, I go across the river, and I'm in TC Williams, soon to be name changed, where we have, everything you could possibly imagine in terms of learning space available to all of our students as a public school, right? And these two things are saying very specific things to our students, to our children, and to our society, and to Patricia's point, also to the community itself. How do we get the community involved to help them see where they are, where they can go, and show this is where we want to go with our learning space? Because really, it is an ecosystem. It is not just falling on the K-12 environment. It is really helping the entire community across that entire adult learning spectrum as well, so that it becomes a community space that is not disjointed and disconnected from the community and going through that.
This is all good stuff. I kind of think of equity in two different realms. One is what I want to call hard equity, and the other one is what I want to call soft equity. The hard equity is what ends up in the building. I think it was already mentioned, the ADA, but universal design, the whole notion of universal design, I think, is an important part of the hard equity part of how we design a building, including schools. And I'm delighted to see that those ideas are now extending to unisex toilets and things that maybe wouldn't have been imagined even 5 years ago. I think that there are a lot of those kinds of things that get cast into the stone of the building, but I kind of want to think a little bit more about who are. I think to get back to some of the points that were raised earlier about who are we designing for. Is it us or them? And as architects, I'll speak as an architect sometimes, we're trained to think that we're supposed to know it, and that we're supposed to know what to do. So we're going to design, so-called design the building, instead of letting the building design itself through the community, or co-design, as we call it. So the notion of co-design first means that I have to get my own equity in order, my interpersonal equity. Right? I have to get my heart in the right place, so that I'm understanding that this is not about me. It's about everybody else but me. And I think that one of the things that I learned a while back from a wonderful theorist at Harvard named Howard Gardner was about multiple intelligences and how we're all different, by the way. We learn differently. and that we need to be thinking about not only how we learn, but we need to be thinking about how everybody else is learning. So whether it's mathematical logical learning, whether it's STEM, a STEM room would be appropriate, and maybe would boost those ideas, or verbal linguistic learning, where this is where writing surfaces and computers and all those other things come in, because we're talking verbal linguistic, or a visual spatial, which we leave out a lot in our design concepts, because so much of our schools have been designed around mathematical, logical, and verbal linguistic thinking or learning. So the notion of visual and spatial, where artwork, I mean, when was the last time you saw a piece of artwork hanging in a school building? It's not so easy, right? Or a mural, or let it go, let the kids paint the school the way they want to do it, right? So, and also musical, and I know Howard had some really good information about interpersonal learning. So we don't really do a good enough job, I think, of providing spaces for people to gather around inside the building and, by the way, outside of the building. So that's another kind of a massive shift that we need to be thinking about. And then what about those intrapersonal learners? The ones that want to curl up in a little bay window somewhere. They don't want to be in the middle of they get confused when there's too much activity. So are we thinking about them? Do we have bay windows in our classrooms? So all of these are things that, and the last one I think is the strongest, and that is the naturalistic learners. You know, how can you imagine that a naturalistic learner is going to get anything out of being in a 900 square foot box all day? So this notion that we have to take the school out of the school and into the community. So what I believe is that the whole community is the learning environment. And we need to stop talking about schools, and we have to start talking about learning environments. And if we look at the whole community as the learning environment, then my neighborhood is an amazing textbook. And I'll refer again to not just Howard Gardner, but the work of Ann Taylor, who developed this beautiful concept about architecture and children, where she says, why don't we learn from nature? What's wrong with the term that she talked about was that all of the world, right, is a three-dimensional textbook. So let's stop as architects thinking about buildings, right? And let's get out of our own box, which is usually made of brick, and let's be thinking about the entire environment that we live in and all the potential that it has to inspire all of those people with all those different learning styles to be sponges, right? To absorb all that math, science, language arts, social studies, and all that really cool stuff that's embedded in the tree, just as much as it is some science experiment.
So that helps frame a number of issues. Inclusion is about including people, right? What's the saying? If it doesn't involve me, it's not for me.
Yes.
And as I look at the chat room, we're getting a lot of questions around specifics. We all can agree that including the community in the process is essential. But we've all gone to town meetings where you go, you comment, but you don't know what happens. So surely there are more authentic ways that we can involve and engage the community. I think our audience would like to hear a little bit more about some specifics around how we engage and involve. And then Imani talked about some very fundamental issues about just maintenance and how that sends messages both to the students and to the community, both out and into the school. Is that strictly a funding issue, or is it more than that? But let's stick with the inclusion during the design process for a little bit. Footnote, I've had a number of questions. Yes, we are recording this. It will be made available after we clean up, my part. And so that will be available for you. Also, we'll record the chat, and there's going to be good content there for you as well. So, but let's build on the inclusion, specific ways that people feel that they are intrinsically and authentically involved in helping shape that learning environment. Who would like to launch this part of the conversation?
I'm happy to, Ron. I have been a part of this. I think that that's a good question, and I appreciate being called out by the chat to really get specific. I've been a part of work along these lines in several different contexts and several different countries. I have to say, in full, like, just frank bluntness, that it is absolutely possible to go about creating an inclusive process for this, and anyone who doesn't go through that is really hiding behind excuses that they probably need to sort of wrestle with themselves. The reality is that we have to be willing, all of us, we have to be willing to do a couple of things. The first of which is recognize that our communities and the communities in which our students are learning, whether that's at a school or throughout their entire communities, have so much to offer. And there is a rhetoric that I think that permeates into a lot of our conversations and a lot of our thinking that somehow creates a deficit-based model that is instantly off-putting for so many of our communities. And I think we have to, first of all, recognize and identify those assets and support communities, to name them and to build upon those. And then secondly, I think that it takes a real commitment to go to and be present in a community. I saw a really poorly done example of this one time when we were putting together a community program, and we decided, the organization I was working with decided to have a roundtable discussion sort of out in the suburban area outside of the city where the school would be, and transportation was an issue for a lot of our students. And there's and to make it a little bit worse, we were able to have it hosted by one of the most expensive spa and resorts in the city of Brussels. And so it's like you're expecting students to leave their home and find a way to you is such an instant failure, right? So I share that example as a non-example to say, how are we coming and presenting ourselves to community members and impact and facilitating conversations where people have a voice and their voice matters, and we can actually and engage in that, and then building that trust. Those are the things I just think are essential. I mean, I have lots of examples of how you would structure those roundtables and how you might do some charrettes and get those get the input from lots of community members. But I think first and foremost, you have to have a little bit of a moment of self-reflection of what your preconceived notion is about a community that you're going into, and then also how willing you are to really do the footwork and get to become a member of that team and to facilitate honest dialogues.
Kyle, I really like how you emphasize trust there. I think coming from the design side, one of the things that I really enjoy that we do once we get started is, just a site walk, right? We just go to our client's school, our client's space, and we walk around with them. And sometimes it presents itself as like a maintenance thing, but really and truly while we're walking, we can hear from the client how spaces are being used and the positives and negatives. And so we're able to start dialogues around, their needs and their goals, and interact with them on their level, and, meet with them physically and meet them where they're at, and understanding how their building works. And sometimes we're not talking directly with maintenance personnel, but we're talking with teachers. And so, we can gain information that we could also gain from maintenance personnel, but not in a different way. And I think it's just a great way that we start that process of designing with by, being in the space, touching and looking at the things that, that are important, but also talking about their day, like how do you use this space, and seeing them move about the space, and understanding information that, we can't necessarily get if we just do like a survey, or if we just have you come to the office and, bring some pictures of the site, right? It's part of that relationship building that we have, and also to always keep the lines of communication open as far as to, what does the school want? What is, like, having that voice that translates all of that information of I guess, lack of better words, complaints and comments and criticisms, right? So we can understand like, what are the values that you have here at the school? Because I think that's part of answering, you know, an equitable question of how can we help you as you are specific and unique for us today.
Yeah, go for it, Amani. I saw you unmute.
I think it's important for us to think about the process again of design where we, I think in a lot of cases, and for most projects, you have a visioning session or a session where you just try to learn as much as you can about a client. And in a school in particular, I don't think 2 hours or like a workshop really does that, right? Like I've had a couple of school clients where they've tried to explain to me what happens in a school, and sometimes they kind of explain in extremes, or they explain almost not, it's like very kind of polarized in their description. And to me, you end up designing for the teacher that says, I'm going to teach math in here. And you're like, okay, cool. And then you try to do something with that versus designing for the behaviors of the students. So in this case, in one case, I spent like 2 days in a school just trying to look at kids, because I'm not around children all the time, and elementary school children all the time. I sat and I was just like, what's going on in here? This is a completely different experience that, like, had I not sat there, I would never know that in the case of when kids come back in from recess, they are wild. It's like they are bouncing off the ceiling, and they need transitional spaces that say, okay, now we're going to bring the mood down to a learning thing. We're going to do something where we are actually just calming ourselves, and you need spaces that are maybe a little darker, maybe a little softer, maybe, even those spaces, which I ended up calling them chill zones, they were spaces that could also function as spaces for behavioral problems, where if a kid maybe has autism and is having a fit of like a physical fit, you don't want that room to have a ton of glass. You don't want that room to be concrete blocks either. You want that room to be soft and accommodating and calming. And so you don't often see spaces like that in schools that are not thinking behaviorally. They're thinking like math, science, STEM, whatever. It's like you're thinking very kind of objectively about something when each space is so subjective. It's really kind of interesting to me. And the time that I spent with the school just ended up being so eye-opening to me. It helped me design with empathy. It helped me design less for like a client and, you know, a student and a teacher. It was just for human beings that need to be supported as they are behaving and learning or not behaving. You know, like there's so many variations on what happens in a school, and there's so much that is a very fair design implication that can resolve or respond to the needs outside of just like, our school colors are burgundy and I think we're going to do that here, or, you know, like we need a playground and we don't have money. Like there's so many other issues, but I think when you really just get down to the fundamental, like empathetic, human being centered, focused design, then you really get something, a very different product, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things that I think about is how I saw some of the questions come through about like, how do we get people on board to start thinking differently about schools and schooling and what education is and all of these things. Like it's important for us to also not only be thinking about school as like this big thing of like learning happens there and that's the place where we all want to go and that's the only place where learning can occur. We can go a lot smaller, and especially what we've seen through COVID and digital learning and remote learning and all of these things, it doesn't have to happen in a space. It can happen anywhere. And if we do it correctly, now, one, it's cheaper, it's better, we're having a better product, and we're providing more opportunities for equitable learning to occur. And these can be closer to the house. They don't have to be this city on a hill. Here is this multi-million-dollar building where we've got 5,000 kids all coming here. It can be in the community. It can be a lot smaller space. What's to stop any number of teachers from going there? And that's a part of it. Right? Like I think about my space here in Wilkinsburg. We have a lot of empty buildings we could take over to have learning spaces. When I was in Alexandria, we physically as a school system couldn't afford to buy any land because there wasn't any. So we had to go through and start thinking differently around what this would look like. We started in a storefront in a mall. And we started doing some more remote learning. We started having students come through. What started with an experiment with 50 quickly grew over to 1,200 students, and we had to find a new and different learning space. But It was then open from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. at night, and people were working in shifts, and it changed the way we thought about schooling. That is how we can start to show that, okay, we're going to build a school doesn't have to mean we have to somehow find $100 million for 5,000 students. We could start rethinking this 1,000 square foot space that could fit X number of students, and we could do all of these different things in here, and it's only going to cost us like 30 grand. Right? Like that now changes the conversation, that changes the risk factor, and that changes what we are thinking about what school could and should be. And it removes that idea of like, this is where we learn history and this is where we learn English, because those walls need to come down, especially with the advent of the internet and I can find anything anywhere, right? Like let's show students how everything connects and start thinking about this is where learning occurs. This is where we can come together to learn about ourselves and about others and start growing that empathy so that we can start having those conversations.
Steve, I'd like to ask you a question, and I think it's probably where you're going to go anyway, but I want to put a fine focus on it. After the levees failed in New Orleans, a lot of bad things happened, but the schools that were already in pretty poor condition really were badly damaged. And Steve was one of a handful of individuals that really led the rebuilding of the New Orleans schools. And I know, because I know you, that engaging the community was central to the process. And I think to respond to some of the questions that are being asked, what are the 3 or 4 necessary key strategies that you and your team used to engage community members as you thought about reimagining New Orleans schools?
Thank you for asking that. But I would say the most important concept of all is authenticity. I think people have been engaged to death, by the way. I think that especially now, engagement is another box that has to be checked off by all the people working on a project. And so this notion of engagement is gone. I mean, I see so much engagement that has to do with somebody making a PowerPoint presentation in front of 200 people instead of making a PowerPoint presentation in a conference room with the principal and the superintendent. But that's not engagement, right? That's just, I mean, we can do that better on Zoom, frankly. An authentic engagement is a tough one because it's easy to use the term engagement. I'm more inclined now to be thinking about the term empowerment. Because what are we engaging the community to do, right? First of all, we're engaging them to co-design, or actually, we are in the service of the community, right? So our goal is to have the community do the design if we could, and we do. So some of the tools that we use to do that are we actually bring people in the community, we hire them. Actually, and instead of there's no community engagement that works, with a microphone in front of 200 people. It's just, you're not going to get anywhere. That works really well for the people who want to disrupt meetings and take over everything and whatever. So what we've learned is that engagement works best when you have no more than 8 people at a table, and you have multiples of 8 tables. And then you provide materials that people can use to actually play what we call gaming, right? So they're actually designing at their table. Well, somebody has to lead that process. And if you have a room full of 200, 300, we've had 400 in a room. Well, then you have to have a lot of people divided by 8 that can host that table. Well, guess who's the best people at doing that? The people from the community. They're the experts. And so why would we bring all of our architects in there to do it? Because we're not the experts. So I think that all of these are little subtle tools, right? And we actually, by the way, because at some point the people go like, well, you're getting paid a big consulting fee, and we're coming to the meeting and now we're sitting at the table and doing this stuff. So we pay them. We pay them as if they were, it's like a second job or whatever. So those are the things that build towards this notion of authenticity. And I kind of want to go back to what Ron was saying earlier about, anything that's planned without me is not about me. And there's a beautiful term from the Yoruba tribe in West Africa called Ubuntu. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's called Ubuntu. And it literally means I am because we are. There's a beautiful piece of research, actually, that came out of Stanford University's Global Project Center. I'll refer you to that. And somebody asked in the text, are we going to get all this information? Absolutely, yeah. We'll do a little bibliography. But it was done by two researchers at Stanford Global Project Center. They started off with the question of what's the cost of not engaging the community, because bad things happen. But they ended up with a report that was published in the Stanford Innovation Review called How to Create Breakout Innovation. And the answer is, you create breakout innovation because all of us are smarter than any of us. And there is actual research that proves that a room full of 100 diverse, keyword, diverse stakeholders can come up with a better idea than the smartest person in the room. And we have to believe that. We as designers and planners have to understand and believe that that's true, that we are not the smartest, that it's not about us, it's about everybody. And so I guess I want to circle back and say that I think we have a lot to learn. I mean, God knows, excuse me, but it's 2020. One of the things that we just learned in the last, number of years is that there's a lot we don't know about democracy, right? I mean, who would have thought that democracy was going to be perfected in 300 years? I mean, that's insane. So we have so much to learn about how to be democratic. And I think we're looking at a lot of our failings every day, right? So I put on the table that that's our challenge. Our challenge is not to check off a box about engagement. Our challenge is for all of us to chip in and figure out all the tools that we need in our toolbox to make sure that that process is one that is for real, that it's authentic, and that it does get to the smartest and the best solution from all of the people involved. And I don't know that any of us know how to do that right now, myself included.
I don't. I actually think it's really interesting, just our profession as architects or urban designers, is how hard it is for us to admit we don't know sometimes. And that the engagement process, like when I sat in that school for 2 days, nobody told me to go there. I just was like, I don't do anything with kids at this age. I do not know. I don't know the answers to these questions. I don't know the psychology. I don't know a lot of things that really should influence a lot of what happens in a school. And I think that's an important just kind of humility thing that we just have to get to, that like admitting is the first step, is what they usually say. It's just we don't have all of the answers. And I was listening to a panel recently where one kind of edgy lady was talking about and talking to a group of probably majority male white architects and designers, just saying, hey guys, like I'm sure you do wonderful things all of the time. But honestly, innovation and futurist thinking, urbanist thinking can only go so far. You can only get so far because there's so many people missing from the table because you just won't let them get there. And you just won't allow the thought that you might be a little ignorant about something because it takes so much to just get to that point. So in thinking through inclusion, yes, it's about the students and engaging the community, but then also the designers and that group of people who are actually responding to problem solving or elevating an experience, I think really needs to be equally as diverse as the community they're serving, or more.
Imani, I really want to put a pin on what you just said, because you just hit it. You just said the most important thing, is that it is about us as designers, all of us in this conversation and all the people who are out there on chat as designers. And the most important way to get to authenticity is through humility. And I think that's the part that we have to learn. It's not on them. We got to start with us. And we have to learn to be humble. Or all of this engagement stuff is just, another form of of control, right? It's control under a different guise. And that's the hardest part, and you hit right on it, Imani.
So we've had some questions from the chat, and I'd like to pull one up. We have a number of educators that are struggling with some of the language we're using. What does soft design mean? How do you design for behavior instead of topic? Might want to spend just a second building a bridge, a communication bridge, to some of our educator listeners. I believe, Imani, it might have been you that talked about soft design in your opening comments, even, perhaps.
Sure. So when I was talking, and this kind of goes to the behavioral question too, when I was working on this school, when I observed some of the behaviors, as opposed to, I didn't really talk to, in that moment, in the 2 days that I spent, I didn't talk to the instructors about what they would be teaching. I was just watching people do stuff. And so that was my one side of the research. Obviously, you do talk to instructors and principals and the administrators too, but really just designing, because you see how a group may behave. At the time, the school was actually in the basement of an old church. And they were really struggling they made it work, but they were struggling with some things in terms of behavior. So they didn't have enough space to eat and learn in different places. So they had to adapt a space every day, 3 times a day, just to make sure that the cafeteria and sort of like a larger open space could be utilized. And so thinking through that, they're used to multi-purpose spaces. So when I look to the new space, their multi-purpose space has many different functions. There's a lot of adaptability just built into whether they use it as an auditorium, whether they're singing and dancing. Sometimes they're doing capoeira. Like sometimes they are having a quiet moment in that space. So the behavior is like, okay, I see these people doing many different types of things and making their spaces work. They had actually, they were moving into a building that was a little bit bigger than what they could currently fill. And so they had to use their other spaces very differently as well. They had a whole floor that they weren't ready to fill in. So they used it almost as like a co-working space and like a community hub that people could use as like an adult, more centered space. And so thinking about adaptability in terms of watching what it like, if I sat there for 2 days and saw them just sitting there staring at a chalkboard, I'd be like, okay, I'm going to design spaces that look like what they want to do, what they naturally kind of do. And especially at their age, like they are definitely naturally behaving in a certain way. And then so thinking, when I saw, one time I actually saw a student who was having a behavioral issue where he was upset and had kind of taken on somewhat of a physical kind of fit. And the only space that they had was a bathroom to help him kind of, privately deal with the issue that he was facing. And that is the worst place for you to be sometimes. If you're a young student, you're in a bathroom with an adult and there's no place to sit, there's nothing comforting about the bathroom. And so when I say soft, I literally mean we then, for the chill zone space that was adaptable for when they come in from recess, or if there's a reason for calming, it was almost like a Turkish corner for kids. It was and you can actually kind of see this. Pinterest has 100 different types of spaces that are just soft curvilinear lighting. It's a darker space, and there's no furniture. There's just kind of pillows everywhere. So you get a chance to kind of relax. And what I was saying is that in that moment, you really don't want hard surfaces to be where, like, if someone's kind of like moving around a ton and can't control their motions or their emotions, you don't want a ton of glass. And a lot of times the administrators, even the design team, were like, well, you want to see into this space, it'll be cool, it'll look great, we want glass there. And they were like, no, because that glass could get broken or we could have a student hurt themselves. And so to me, it was really just listening and then realizing, like, yeah, you're totally right. And we thought we were right again, aesthetically, we thought we were right because we wanted to see into this cool space. When in reality, when you need that privacy, And you need something that is just a little nurturing and that can actually bring you down to, you know, a more calming state. You want softer walls, you want padding on the walls, you want carpet, you want it to be quieter. So you want to control acoustics and lighting in a different way, and allow students to actually just kind of decompress in that space, as opposed to being active learners that are like, you know, so attentive. So that's what I meant by soft spaces.
I would like to invite our audience to participate here for a minute in this conversation, because what we're after is what kind of learning is, what's the most powerful learning? Where does the most powerful learning take place? Is it in a soft space, in a hard space? And everybody's different. So I want to challenge everybody to chat in and tell us, what is the most powerful learning experience that you've had in your life, right? What is it? I mean, I'll tell you mine. I was getting night crawlers to go trout fishing, and one night, and I had my flashlight, and it just so happens that I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and so, you know, the best place to get night crawlers in Charlottesville, keep the secret now, is on the lawn at the University of Virginia. So I looked up and I saw these beautiful buildings designed by Thomas Jefferson, and I thought, maybe instead of an auto mechanic, I'll be an architect. Boom. I want everybody to think about what was a really powerful experience for you, and then at the end of the conversation, I want to go back and make an observation. So let's make this participatory.
Well, here they come. Nobody else learned from collecting worms, though, Steve. I think you're unique in that.
I'm sure there's plenty of wacky examples.
Well, let's let people respond to that a little bit. And I'm kind of looking up in the upper left corner of my screen and noticing that Dan Foreman hasn't been talking much.
Well, you know how I kind of stand back a little bit.
We believe that the integration of space and technology provides alternatives about learning and school that have previously not been really fully explored. And obviously access to technology is a subject for this topic today. But Dan, what thoughts have been going through your mind in terms of what role, you know, technology needs to play in helping design equitable and inclusive space?
You know me, I have many, but I also have a 4-year-old running around upstairs. So I was trying to be a little respectful on that one. So I apologize if you hear that. But for me, it's really thinking about, okay, I saw a few comments in there. It's like, how do we get the people who are saying like, well, can't we just build the school that we built 40 years ago? And it's like, well, technically that didn't work then, and it doesn't definitely work now. So how can we really rethink what this is? Because all of those were built around control as opposed to learning and freeing up what we are doing for learning. Everything in a school building built within the last like 50 years, except for a few other examples, are based around, this is the front of the classroom. This is where learning occurs. Everybody should look this way. I am in charge and I'm going to control everything that's happening in here. And whatever is going on in your mind has no place. If you have something going on, you should probably leave and go to someplace else so that you can collect yourself and then come back. None of that works, right? Like technically none of that has ever worked. So how can we then bring more of our students' ideas into the classroom? How can we change this idea around what a classroom is and get away from like, let's have like all of these learning things that are built in and bolted to the walls and the desks are bolted to the floor. And that was my first classroom. Like I couldn't move anything. I couldn't have my kids move around and do all of that. So the idea of having more flexible learning spaces, providing opportunities for the kids to take control over it. And one of the things that we kind of run into around this issue of teachers having ownership over their space is that we expect them to decorate it. We expect them to pay for any additional furniture. They have to do it on their own. And then they get a $250 deductible at the end of the year off their taxes. And that's it. That will force somebody who is making $50,000 a year to own that space and say that this is mine and this is everything happening within this walls. This is what's going to happen here because this is where it is. And I'm going to shut the door. The idea of moving away from that right? And having learning own the space as opposed to an individual own the space, or really have the kids own the space, right? Like, one of the things that really changed for me teaching was I got rid of like my teacher desk. I had a little rolling thing that I had my laptop moving around, because now I can get around, I can do everything that I need to do. I can take my computer out in the hallway, I can come back in here and have everything that I need. That's a different way of thinking around what education is and where we could go. I am now coming to you as the individual student and looking at you as the individual, because I now have the space and have commanded my space to make it more accessible to everybody. If we could get more folks into that type of a mindset around what we're trying to do and away from this mindset of control over the body, now we are freeing up the mind to go wherever they need to do. That's the idea of these types of learning spaces, right? Of like, we can still have built-in stuff, but actually have well-designed built-in stuff and have it be more flexible and have more opportunities for students to take control over that space, instead of as soon as I walk in, my identity does not matter. I have to fall and I have to comply with the identity of this educational space. And what does that mean to me as an individual? Like, now we're getting to the discussion around equity. Now it's getting to that discussion around like, how do you bring your fullest self to this educational space? Because that's what really has value, right? I don't want to negate that. I want to bring that up, and I want to bring that to the forefront and honor it, because that's really what's going to help you to self-actualize and grow as an individual. And that's really what we're like trying to get to, right? And all of this technology helps with that, because why should we still continue to have students memorize and remember basic facts and have them go on a test when I can Google all of that, when really what's mattering is how can I take all of these facts to put something together in a new and different way and create something new and different that we didn't even know we needed. That's the goal. That's really what we're trying to do for education. And I think that's where all of our learning spaces need to go as well. Right? Why can't I tear the walls down and put them back up and do them in ways that the kids are driving all of this, or the learners, as I should say, because we'd have adult learners in there as well. And that's where I want to go.
And I just would love to make a, sorry, Josh, I just want to make a quick connection, because I couldn't love more when, and it looks like the chat does too, I couldn't love more what you're saying about this idea of space and ownership. I feel like that bleeds in, and I want to make a connection to instructional approaches as well, right? Like teachers, that sense of control over space and ownership of space bleeds into also, I have this approach to teaching students. And it's interesting because I'm looking at the chat, and there's one common theme that is so clear as we get a chance to look through. Almost every single person, aside from maybe the worms, Steve, everyone's big life learning moment has come with an experience, has come with creating meaning for themselves and having the opportunity to explore the world around them. And that's what's missing, I think, sometimes when we try to like fit ourselves into a typical square box, is you get that ownership, not just on space, but also about curriculum. And it denies so many of these experiences that I think we're really shaping all of the people in our attending this call. So thanks for that, Dan.
And one thing I think, to build off of what Dan had talked about, it makes me think about an experience back when I was in education as a school leader. Quickest way to be the least popular person is to remove all of the teacher desk, which I did. So nobody had a desk in the classroom, and you'd be amazed at what results and just how much more we interacted as a staff, interacted with students. So again, I think someone said hashtag Dan 2024, 2028. Definitely support that. But one question that's been on my mind as we're thinking about just the current context, to bring us back to where so many schools are now closing again, or they're still going to operate in a remote or hybrid model until 2021. And this ties into technology as well. How can we leverage this opportunity of what we are learning that's working and not working in this hybrid and remote learning environment that could generate conversations about rethinking and redesigning that space moving forward? Because I imagine many people on this call are already thinking about the next academic year. What does that look like? What can we take that really worked well and apply it, versus going back to the very traditional teacher owning the space, basing the North Star, downloading information. And so just curious on either advice for people to have those conversations, or things that you have seen either from your own kind of working remote environment or from a school environment that we should be thinking about to generate these conversations moving forward, to think ahead and redesign the space and make sure it is equitable and inclusive.
Joshua, I was also thinking of leveraging technology, as Dan spoke to earlier. And sometimes I actually am a lecturer at CU Denver this semester, and I always tell my students to leverage the technology and not, let it dictate what's going on. And I've been teaching virtually, actually, so this has been quite an experience. But what I think of when I think of technology is like, we have a lot of building technology as well that enables us to create a whole variety of flexibility within our spaces. And so I think even prior to our current situation with the pandemic, that the desire for flexibility was really strong, especially here in Colorado, in the Denver and Aurora city areas. That need for flexibility is really strong from students and from teachers. And when I talk about flexibility, I mean literally moving walls, as Dan was talking about. So I worked on about 13 small projects in the course of like 2 years, where every one of those projects we took down at least one wall and we put up at least a movable partition in its place, or we left it open. And so the inclusion of all of these different building technologies were very different from school to school. And so that spoke to how each school were thinking about using those pieces of technology. And so moving forward now into this age that we're in, especially specifically, I think of social distancing. And so having the ability to make that classroom that works for whatever number of students in a time where we don't need to be socially distant, and then being able to quickly expand and have that space, I think that is some way that we can start to mitigate the conditions that we have to operate in. And then as far as working virtually, the idea that also what we saw, unfortunately, is that not all students have access to a computer, to internet, to working internet, to stable internet, myself included. I had to do a lot of things during this transition. And so that speaks to the equity again. And so understanding that we can provide space, individual space that is shifting. We talk about this as far in our workplace as well, as like, maybe we don't need all these workstations anymore, but we need a station. And so the idea that a student can come, in need, and then still be able to connect to the rest of the class for hybrid learning as well, right? Because we're not only looking at virtual learning now, we're looking at hybrid learning where some people are in the classroom and some people are virtual. So offering those spaces with flexibility, offering spaces that come equipped with sound and acoustic assistance and the data and power. I spend a lot of time coordinating that. Each school is different with, whichever teaching board they use, and the other, either it's a cart, right, with the Chromebooks. I know of those. We had a lot of fun trying to coordinate those ones. Or it's the smart board, or it's the Promethean board, right? So these devices, understanding and equipping a classroom to quickly allow a teacher to hook up into them and then, move spaces as well. So offering that building flexibility, I think, will be key.
I want to add to that idea that flexibility idea is that let's jump outside the box of the school and say, what if the school was the hub of learning, but the entire community was the place where learning takes place? And I'm just looking at some of the notes that have come back from our participants. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm not surprised, is that most powerful learning experience happened in places other than classrooms. And classrooms, some people said, it was my teacher, or it was in this classroom, or whatever. But the majority of people had other places where their most powerful learning occurred. So if our goal is the most powerful learning possible, then why wouldn't we look at the entire community as the opportunity for that, and have this specialized center, which is the hub, but it's not a school. It's not the place where you go to learn, but it's got all that stuff. It's got technology for people who don't have technology. We make sure our transportation systems are up and going. Instead of investing in this edifice, right? I mean, let me say, architects are the enemy here. We have what I would call an edifice complex. That's what we get paid to design buildings. We get this big rush, out of seeing this thing that people spend millions of dollars on. Well, we need to get rid of that concept, right? We need to be thinking that the whole community is the most powerful learning environment that we could have. Now, let's figure and think of that as a complex adaptive system, and that we just have to make connections. And that's a lot less expensive than bricks and mortar. So, and we should be spending money on transportation systems so that everybody has access. And we should be spending money on technology so that we can do virtual learning for the people who love virtual learning. And for people who need physical learning, they need to go to the hub. And teachers have that flexibility, as Dan was talking about, not only of having control over their so-called box of classroom, their 900 square foot box, but maybe teachers need to be able to say, I don't even want to work in this building. I want to take my class out in the community every day. I don't ever want to come here. And that's the world that we're now changing into, because I know that my daughter, for example, was working in San Francisco, and her husband were both working in San Francisco. And guess what? They just moved to live with us in New Orleans because they don't have to be in San Francisco anymore. And they don't have to live in a 500 square foot box. They don't, and Google is now putting 50% of their employees, out without having to come to work every day. So this is going to be the new normal. And I've read so much about how, well, remote learning is not working. Well, I'm sorry. It's probably working sometimes, and it's probably not working other times, and it works for some people and doesn't work for other people. So let's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is no silver bullet. There's a way for us to design systems thinking design where we can get to where we want to go if we stop trying to design the perfect box or the perfect edifice or the whatever it is. It's all out there waiting to be engaged.
Thanks, Steve. As we approach the last 10 minutes, I do want to raise one topic that Imani led with, just because I think we must address it. I said at the beginning that before the pandemic, we were on schedule to spend $50 billion on new, modernized, and renovated schools. But that's not spread evenly across the United States. And we have places that have an abundance of funding. We have a lot of places that have no funding at all. And I think the larger challenge that Imani raised is these schools that really are, D- on the maintenance side of things. It's a physical issue, but it's also a psychological issue. It's a statement about the community. And, I think we could do a whole forum on the topic of how we need to explore different strategies for how we fund our public schools. And so I don't want to leave that as, at least we're acknowledging that in today's conversation, and it's a topic we should spend more time on. Imani, I don't know if you would like to add any more to that since you raised the topic first.
Well, I will just repeat again, I do not know solutions to pretty much anything, but I do think that in this case in particular, I have really thought about, especially in the context of what we accept as spaces or code minimums, and what might be prohibitive actually for architects to engage if the cost is prohibitive, if it's something that becomes too complex or too massive, like if you're trying to fix an entire structural issue or a whole plumbing system of a municipality, that's beyond some of our scope sometimes. And so that becomes prohibitive. And I think the cost, again, becomes very prohibitive. Even our fees sometimes become something where we cannot come fully to the table, or we choose not to fully come to the table because we're not getting paid. And so I think that's a really huge issue. I've gone so far as to think about policies where, especially in Detroit, the surrounding suburban tax bases are higher, and they're spending a lot of money on their beautiful, amazing public schools that is almost not necessary. Like their maintenance and their improvements are not really necessary, whereas there are schools in Detroit that are suffering. And I always wonder, can we mandate a shifting of tax dollars? Can we say, like, when there is a deficit here, can we balance things out? Can we do that? And I'm always met with, you are insane. If I'm in the tax bracket where I'm from, Montclair, New Jersey, great tax bracket, great public schools. If someone tried to take something away from my education experience, my mom would flip the city upside down. There's no way that would become a really realistic thing. But then now listening in this discussion that has been amazing, just thinking, if we do kind of deconstruct the actual public school, and a lot of times, and in Detroit in particular, the public schools are governed by the community district. So it's very hard to break into that kind of like political system and start moving things around and changing their rules. But when you start to think about right sizing, adaptability, flexibility, thinking about whether the spaces are actual schools versus whether they're just spaces where sometimes learning can occur, but other times they're a library, other times they are co-working, other times it's just kind of a housing for multiple different activities, then your tax dollars are applied in a really different way. I've seen that when Detroit public schools can be repurposed as something else, they can be really, really well supported spaces. They can be beautiful, beautiful spaces when you really put the money into it. They can be housing, they can be anything really. They're not always well positioned to do that, but I saw somebody ask a question about how do you do this when a community is growing or shrinking? And Detroit is a perfect example of that. We have so many vacant schools that may never return. In fact, they have been closed for decades and decades. You don't know what's going to happen with those spaces. But if you think that those spaces don't have to come back as a school, then they could pretty easily be repurposed. And I think you can really think a lot about how everyone in the chat has said, or not everyone, some people have said, oh, I learned by traveling. I learned in different spaces. And one concept that I've applied to a project is that every space is a learning space. There's nothing about the classroom versus the cafeteria versus all of these spaces. Like, you weren't doing it that way before. There's no reason to change that behavior now. The hallways are a place for you to learn, for you to address and really engage students, use them in a different way. They're not just circulation. And so I think that about a lot of different spaces. I think cost and tax bases and the disparities can be solved by building in that adaptability and the flexibility to use the space how the community really needs to versus what we're forcing them to do by way of a public education strict system.
Okay, thank you. So in our last few minutes, I'd like to do a round robin. What are the key items that you think you want to walk away with this, or you want our chat room to walk away with this? And I'll start it out just to give you all time to think. One, I heard impassioned conversation around the idea of authentic engagement, and some examples were given. There are a lot of examples out there, but that's an aspiration. If you don't include me, it's not for me, is kind of the philosophy that seems to drive that. The second thing I seem to be hearing is that a really well-designed learning environment that's active and that is engaging and that is leaning into new ways of kind of getting involved in learning, that's going to be the same in any school. It's not an equity and inclusion issue. Every student learns that way, and we can apply these principles of the design of the learning space across the board. Finally, as it relates to maintenance, I would guess, and I don't know this, that the majority of buildings that are the way that Imani described are going to be in our underserved, poor neighborhoods in urban communities. And if our mayors and our governors and the new administration is serious about equity, then we need to start investing in these neighborhoods in meaningful ways to bring support to these unsupported communities, not just the students, but their families and their neighbors and the whole community. So those are some of the things I picked up. Dan, we'll start with you, and then you call on the person you want to have go next on the round robin.
Will do. I'll try and keep it short, but for me, it's one of those things of it's always about engagement and keeping teachers and students into the fold. And for those of you that are concerned about starting too big, like start small, start with a small space and start thinking about, okay, here's an unused space in this school. Hey, maybe we get some students teams together where we partner with some volunteer architects and just talk about how could we do this without like hammer and nails, but just designing what could happen in this room. That's a very low cost, low effort, but you're also talking about student engagement. You're including voice, you're including a lot of things within those types of projects and showing them trajectories around where you could go. The other thing that I constantly think about, especially living here in Wilkinsburg where I live, is if 50% of work is remote now and not going back, that changes the game for property taxes, which traditionally fund schools. That changes the game for a lot of neighborhoods that have been completely forgotten about. My house was vacant for a couple of years before I moved here. I can now choose to live and work wherever I choose to. I don't have to go and work and live close to where I work and send my kids there. I made an active choice to do this and just decide where my tax dollars go to fund schools in neighborhoods that are traditionally underfunded. And that's why I live where I live. That is something that is happening more often, not only in my neighborhood, but in other neighborhoods across the country. People are leaving these places because they don't have to be living close to it. What does that mean long-term for where our schools will be? Because now everything is changing rapidly and dramatically, and it has to be moving forward equitably. And if we're not including everybody in that conversation, we as a society are losing out. And I will go to Patricia.
All right. Okay. So I think what resonates and is still going to be with me after this conversation is the idea of humbly serving, and that, you know, whoever I'm working with, whoever space this is unique, and the solution or the result, the end goal will be unique to them as well. I think sometimes it's easy to say, well, every school will get an innovation center, maker space of this, and that. And then they're going to have all these technology as well. But I think a great solution is understanding the community that you're serving, understanding who the people are, and, you know, really supporting them, really providing the things that they're lacking for. And so it's within that service and understanding and respect of the people you're working with, the community, the students, the ideas, the voices, and the personalities.
And who would you like to have follow you?
We can go to Steve.
Well, the more I think about this, the more I think that this group of people together represents a big idea. And the big idea is that it's not just all architects, and it's just not technology people, and it's not just who, you know, we come from different perspectives, right, on this very group, educators. And we don't do enough of this. We have lots of conversations internally with our little pod group. So a lot of words have been thrown on the table. I want to throw one more on, and that's collaboration. I think that if we really want to get to this ubiquitous kind of learning opportunity, which I think is where we need to go, we need to for one thing, we need to rethink what we mean when we say school. And maybe we need to change that to learning environment, which includes everything and that's learning anywhere and everywhere. So the only way we can get there is by working together and bringing all of our different perspectives to bear on how to create the most powerful learning environment that could possibly exist. And none of us has the answer for that, but all of us probably does have the answer for that.
Who's next, Steve?
Oh, I'm sorry. How about Kyle?
Thanks. I will go really quick. I know we're right at time. I want more than anything for us all to part on a quick reflection of the fact that we are in a moment where inequity is being so significantly expanded, and the impact of Black and Brown communities, the impact, I should say, of this pandemic on Black and Brown communities is so much greater than in so many other different communities. So I want to name that because if nothing else, I hope we come away from this conversation thinking differently about how we will build back our education system, and hopefully it wasn't serving everyone before. And I'm really hopeful and optimistic that the way that we build back can be more inclusive and can be provide more opportunity for all of the students that are participating in it. And Imani, will you close us out?
No pressure. I think that one thing that we've talked about a bit is just the economic implications of what any of this work really means. And I think in a lot of ways that can be a barrier or prohibitive, as we just talked about. And I think in so many ways we've talked about how equity or inequities have been so present in our experiences. And that to me makes it optional in some communities. And to us, I think this group on the call, equity cannot be optional. I think whatever barriers are ahead of you, whether it's finances, whether it's complications and structures, it's imperative that you push through and make sure that equity is at the forefront of your priorities, no matter how optional the surrounding group may make it seem. So that's what I'm leaving with, is just it's not an option, it's not a choice anymore. I think sometimes designers can walk away from a project that is too complex or is not well funded, and that choice is too dangerous for us to be leaving on the table. So that's what I'm walking away with.
And I'm going to call on Josh to give us his wrap up.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, this conversation has been absolutely amazing. I have sticky notes and notes all over the place with ideas, and just so appreciative of the insight and the knowledge that was present on this panel. I think for me, just like the problems that we've discussed today, they're only becoming more urgent as time goes by, and just reiterating the fact to just encourage everyone to think about like what we can do right now using the resources that we already have available to us. We know that this funding will come in the future, but how can we actually put some of the ideas that were discussed here in the panel or in the chat into immediate action? And I think one call out to the philanthropic community, we believe as a funder, one of the most important things that we can do is to convene voices like this from a wide range of different industries and areas of expertise. And so we believe like money alone is rarely the single factor that will solve either systemic or emerging issues. And right now, we truly have this opportunity to help share this knowledge that can help us develop solutions that can truly work across all sectors. And we are just really hopeful and excited and appreciative for everyone participating in this crucial part of the process, and looking forward to finding ways that we can help apply the knowledge that we have all gained here today.
Thanks, Josh. Thank you all again. It's great to see people bring their passion, their intellect, and their experience to these kinds of conversations, because they're tough. But you all did a brilliant job, and I thank you for that. I just want to say to you and the folks that are listening, we are planning one more forum on January 14th. It will be a synthesis of all the work that we've done this year. I mentioned early on that we've looked at equity, technology, crisis preparedness, and active learning. We're going to begin to integrate those topics across a series of conversations on January 14th. Everyone that is listening today or participating will be invited. And some of you may be even asked to serve on panels, especially, Dan, if you bring your moose. So it's always nice to have a smile at the end of a serious conversation. Thanks again. And to those of you that joined us in the chat room, thanks for participating. You were profoundly active in your chats. So those will be recorded. The session was recorded and will be posted on our website at reimagineschools.us. Not today, not tomorrow, because we have to edit out all of my silliness. But other than that, it'll be ready for you to share with you and your colleagues. Thanks again, all. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.